Computers have been part of our everyday life for quite some time now, and yet the technology is still expanding at a rapid pace. Unfortunately, IT security just continues to lag behind, and in part it's because, well, security is the last thing manufacturers are thinking of, especially when it comes to the retail sector. Now, fortunately, we're not at the stage where we're going to have to start worrying about a chip in our brain getting hacked, or at least not yet. But we do need to be concerned about IT security at home. So, if that's something you want to learn more about, then stick around and watch this video, because that's exactly what we'll be covering. Now, for most people, this is what a home network's going to look like, or at least thereabouts, basically. I've got a few devices here, but typically this is what the network looks like, or at least starts off like. Because the idea is most of us just want access to the internet. There are services out there. Maybe you want to stream a video, purchase something online. I mean, whatever. You need access to the internet, or at least your devices do. And it's a case of you'll take out a subscription to a service provider. They'll either have a circuit installed in your building, or if there's one already there, they'll probably take over the ownership of it. And then you'll get one of these boxes sent out. Now, this thing is an all singing, all dancing computer, basically. It does many things, but the idea is you should be able to just plug this into the circuit that's in the building, and then you just connect all your computers up to it, and that's it. You've got access to the internet. It's very much a plug and play solution to make life as easy as possible. And once it's up and running, that's it. You've got access to the internet. Now, it is an all singing, all dancing device, and then it's a wireless access point which allows wireless devices to connect to it. It's a switch which allows physical devices to be, you can literally take a cable, plug it into the network card on your computer, and then plug the other end into a port that's in this inbuilt switch. It's an actual router, or a router if you want to call it, because it's connecting two different networks together. I mean, this is the internet here. It's just a cloud, because basically it's just so vast. There's so many different entities out there, public networks, private networks, you name it. It's easy to just, make it look like this big, nice, fluffy cloud and call it the internet. But it's a case of this device is acting as a router because it's routing or routing between the two networks. It's also a DHCP server because it's handing out IP addresses to all the devices that connect to it. And it's a DNS forwarder because it's forwarding any DNS requests out to typically the DNS servers belonging to the ISP. So that when your computer goes and tries to connect to www.youtube.com, this device will get a response from a DNS server. Your computer will get an IP address, and that's it. You've got a connection to the internet. One of the real crucial things you get with it is a firewall built into it as well. And this is extremely important, especially nowadays, because of, what is effectively a digital Wild West out there. It's a case of, it started off where, kind of had like people who were just kind of curious, let's see if we can break into NASA and find out if UFOs exist. But it's got pretty nasty nowadays, because there are people out there who are trying to extort money out of people. There are scams going on and all sorts. They'll try to hack into anything they possibly can to ransom your computer data or whatever, just so they can extort money out of you. They actually run it as a business. They actually hire people to do this sort of stuff. But they also have computers that are running 24/7 that are constantly going out and probing every IP address that exists out there on the internet to see if they can find weaknesses or at least the potential to try and log into something. Fortunately, the firewall that comes with this device, as long as this is kept up to date on security and so on, what should happen is this firewall should block anything on the internet trying to access your network. If there's a computer out here and it tries to get access to the IP address that this box has got, because it'll either come with a static IP address from your service provider, or it'll get a dynamic one from them, which regularly changes. Either way, these computers don't mind. They're running 24/7. What will happen is it will try to connect to your IP, for example, and the firewall will just drop the traffic. That's what it does by default out of the box. Now, what it doesn't do, though, is it doesn't stop traffic exiting the network. So that's to make things all, plug and play and simple. So if your computer tries to connect to a website, Then the firewall, it'll allow it through. It'll produce a sort of like a record in its stateful table, as it's called, so that when the response comes back, it knows to allow that response back. So traffic can go out, it can come back again, but what can't happen is traffic can't be initiated out here and get access to your network unless you deliberately allow it. And I do know there are people out there that might run their own Minecraft server that do port forwarding and so on, which I wouldn't advise unless you really know what you're doing, you've got some proper DMZ set up. But out of the box, this is relatively safe. It still needs work, but the thing is, well, times are moving on. There's a lot of technology coming out, more and more people are embracing it, and these networks are getting bigger. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look. Now, if you haven't already, chances are you might have installed a NAS into your network, a network attached storage. I mean, if you've got data that's sensitive, private, you just can't afford to lose it, it's too big of a risk to leave it onto a computer. So next thing you know, we've got a network attached storage suddenly has joined our network. And then all of a sudden there was this just snowball effect where smart technology took off. I mean, it's not just about like, smart TVs that are connecting out to like Netflix or something like that. I mean, they don't go through a cable provider, they don't go up to a satellite link. They're connecting out through the internet now. But these are smart appliances as well. I mean, the fridge is smart, the washing machine's smart, the tumble dryer can be smart, your door can be smart, your bulbs are smart. There's just so many smart appliances that have been created, and they're constantly evolving. They all need network access, and yet the security on these devices seems to have taken a sort of like a back seat. One of the biggest risks I would sort of feel is the fact that if you've got, say, like a fridge, for example, chances are it's connecting out to a server on the internet through a cloud service solution. I mean, you may have a phone connected to the same home network, but chances are the phone's connecting to a server on the internet, and the internet's then going and talking to the fridge and vice versa. I mean, if there's like some notification that your washing machine needs to send your phone, it doesn't go direct to your phone. It'll go out to the internet and then from there back to your phone. So the problem we've got is we're introducing these kind of like holes in the network getting bigger and bigger, but we're introducing security risks. And of course, the biggest change for most of us is that some of us are ending up having to actually work from home. I mean, some of us actually got introduced to this sort of thing a long time ago, to be honest. But for some, it's a kind of like a cultural shock. All of a sudden, you've got an employee laptop. This will connect you to the business, or it'll connect you to Office 365, to Zoom, whatever. But you've got to put what is a third-party device on your network. You don't manage it. You've got no control over this device. You don't truly know what it's getting up to. I mean, it's one thing trusting, somebody who's providing the operating system on a computer. You've gone out and purchased the entire thing in a shop, or you've built it yourself and installed the operating system. It's one thing to trust something like that, but when this is a device you've got no manageability over, alarm bells should be going off. It's a third-party device on your own internal private network. And when you look at it from this sort of like perspective, you see all these little devices all connected up to this one single device. It's only when you start to look at the bigger picture that you start to think, yeah, I think we've got a problem here. And that's because all of these devices are on what you would see as being a flat network. I mean, this box here, yeah, it's handing out IP addresses to all these individual devices, and yeah, it's providing them access to the internet, and yeah, it's protecting you from the internet. But the problem is, all of these devices can connect to each other, or at least they have the potential to, because there's nothing getting in the way. Whether it's the access point on this box or the switch, it doesn't block anything internally. So the risk that you've got is that, say this hub here, it's a smart hub, say that this got compromised, or say somebody managed to find out the login credentials for a cloud account that you've got for your fridge. It's now compromised. And the problem is, these devices have all got direct access to each other, and the way hackers work is they'll use one device. Once they're into the network, they'll use that device to then try to get access to other devices, and they're trying to get better and better security permissions effectively to ultimately try and get your data, or encrypt it to ransom, send you a ransom note to say pay us so money in Bitcoin, or if you want your data back, or okay, they might start messing around with your light bulbs or something, but the bigger threat is the data. On the other hand, it's a case of we have heard of like smart home devices actually being used for denial of service attacks, though, and that's on a more serious note. Yes, it doesn't affect you personally, but from a legal perspective, your device could be actually being used in a denial of service attack against an actual business, for example, in order to extort money out of them. The hackers actually got all of these devices dotted around the internet, and it's stopping this business from working. If they can't work, well, they'll go out of business. So it's a case of pay up and we'll stop. And one of your devices could actually be involved in that. So yeah, when you look at it from this perspective, it's a threat to you, but it's also a threat to people on the internet. So you can't really have this flat network. You've got to start breaking things up. You've got to start putting them into their own individual little segment. But we've also got to really take a good look at this, because this is just a device. That's the only thing that's sitting between you and the internet. If somebody can get into this device, they've got access into everything here. And that is a big, big concern, especially if you've got any, sensitive data or personal data. Yeah. From a security perspective, this needs, well, a lot more thought. Now, you might start looking at this diagram and thinking, that looks a bit complicated. It looks more like something out of a business solution. And to be honest, it is pretty much what you would do for a business, because you've got to treat security a lot more seriously. But we've got to do that as home users as well. This is our network. These are sensitive devices in terms of like the data they carry and so on. So we've got to take a lot more security on board to protect not only what's coming in from the internet, but also what's leaving our own network going out to the internet, and also protecting devices on our network from each other. It's just the nature of the internet these days, and the technology we're starting to bring into our actual network. So there's going to be more and more devices getting added to our network over time. CCTV cameras are getting more common nowadays, as well as these smart home solutions, and more people are starting to work from home and so on, and who knows where that's going to go. But the point is, we need to put in layers of security to make life as difficult as possible for a hacker. It's not just a problem now of keeping people out of your network, via the internet. We've actually got to keep it all contained as well, so that if something does go rogue on our network, there's only so much damage it can do. It's one thing, if one of these devices gets compromised on our smart network, okay, you might start seeing like the light bulbs going on and off, but at least it can't get access to the NAS. So the idea is to put all these layers in, make it as difficult as possible, because when it comes to hackers these days, you're typically looking at somebody who's trying to make money out of it. If it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of effort, that means it's going to cost them money, and there's going to be a cut-off point where they'll just move on. It's not in their interest to invest a lot of money into trying to hack into something if it's going to cost them more money than they're going to get back, for example. So we just want to make it as difficult as possible for hackers and mitigate the risk if something does go wrong. So we'll go from the top basically here, where we've got a device that's connected to the internet. Now, this is not going to be something from your internet service provider. I'm not going to get into the politics. I'm not going to get into the concerns about privacy and so on. The point is, this is a device that's been given to you by your service provider. Personally, I don't necessarily know what management capabilities they've got of that device. I don't know what it's really getting up to. I could monitor it and so on, but I'd rather go out and buy something from a vendor that I'm pretty confident that I'm the only person who can manage it. You're taking a bit of a risk in the sense that there are some vendors out there who came out in the press where it was turns out that they had a user account and a password that was baked into the operating system. And I'm talking about some of the big names. I can't remember whether it was used for quality of service testing or what have you, but it was a baked in user account. And it was a case of if somebody knew how to get management access to your device, then they could actually log in and use that account against you. To be able to do that, they'd have to be on the inside of your network, to be fair, because if you've got like a device like this one where it's sitting on the internet and it's got a firewall on it, it shouldn't be allowing management access in from the internet in the first place. Now, if it's got a security bug on it, then that's a way to get around it, but it's a risk we're going to have to take. So it's a case of this device, it's going to depend on your circumstances. It's going to depend on the actual internet circuit presentation that you've got, for instance. It might be a case of you might be able to plug a firewall in there because that's exactly what you'd prefer, a dedicated firewall, which is a lot more secure, a lot more protective for your network. On the other hand, it might be a case of this is going to be another router, one that's got a built-in modem, for example, but it has to have a firewall. We don't have to have, one that also can do wireless, because we want to protect our wireless even more. We don't want something that's touching the internet directly. So we don't want wireless capabilities. I mean, if you've already got something like this, maybe you can just disable the wireless, for example, on that device. But you have to keep this thing up to date for security patches and so on. And if it goes out of support, it's a case of you're going to have to replace it anyway. So yeah, I can't really point out anything in particular because it's always going to vary. But this device here, this is going to be an actual dedicated firewall. It has to be. You don't want to compromise on that because it's just Ethernet connections either side, a couple of RJ45 cables. So that's going to be a proper firewall. Now, you can go out and buy an actual firewall appliance, or you can build your own computer and just install a firewall operating system on it. You don't have to spend, tens of thousands of dollars on some commercial product that you're going to keep in support, every year, but you can if you want. I mean, there are vendors out there making firewalls for, small office, home office businesses, basically. So you can go down that path if you like. Always comes down to your budget, but make sure it's a proper firewall. What we don't want is a computer that's running a firewall as a virtual machine, because the problem with that is that if somebody can compromise the hypervisor, then you're at risk that your firewall can actually be, kicked to the curb, basically. So we definitely don't want a computer that's running both of these devices as a virtual firewall. And we don't want this as being a computer that's your Plex server and something and your NAS or whatever, because they're all virtual machines. This is just a firewall. That's it. End of story. We have to have two separate devices. They've got to be different vendors. So even if these are two actual firewalls, they've got to be different vendors, because if this device can be exploited through a software bug, for example, then so can this. They'll use exactly the same technique to breach this, and this is our last line of defense. This is the last thing that protects all of these devices from the internet. This is our first line, this is our second line, and we're using this to give us the more security, but also because it gives us time to notice if we've been breached. So for example, this device here, it has a public IP address on the internet. What that means is this device is directly reachable from the internet. This device, on the other hand, there's just a cable between these two computers, and this device has a private IP address. That's what we're using between these two computers here. That's private IP addressing, which means nobody has a means to get direct access to this firewall from the internet unless you introduce something like port forwarding on this the firewall here. That is something I wouldn't recommend. I mean, if you know what you're doing, entirely up to you, but I wouldn't recommend it, because by doing this, what it means is we're a lot more secure in that we don't expect to see any messages popping up saying, oh, somebody's trying to get SSH access into the firewall, or somebody's trying to get access to a SQL server, for instance. We do expect it on this because this is facing the internet, but not on this. So if this device all of a sudden starts seeing requests for even HTTPS access to this specific device or its specific IP address, for instance, we know that that device there has been breached. So it's very easy to spot the breach, and it's very easy for us to protect against it. It buys us time, because if we start seeing those messages, we pull the plug to the internet and we do what's necessary to fix this problem, because this box, it's breached, you can't trust it. If we didn't have this, it's too late. If we go back to like the original solution, which was just, your ISP's router, that's it. Once that's breached, it's game over. At least here we're buying ourselves time. So when it comes to the actual network, the internal network, we actually have to start splitting this device up, or the network up itself, I should say. So for that, we need what's called a managed switch. I say managed in the sense that if it's unmanaged, you can't do anything to it. And what we need are VLANs. So you have to have a managed switch. And that has to be able to allow you to create VLANs and to be able to assign VLANs to specific port, for example. And that's only something you can do with a managed switch. I'd be surprised if you purchased a managed switch that couldn't do that, but do double check just to be on the safe side. Because the idea is each of these little blocks, these little networks that we've got, they're all little mini networks. They're all virtual LANs, basically. Any physical device, we'll patch it into a port on this switch and we'll assign it to a different VLAN. And when you've got devices that are in different VLANs, it means they can't talk to each other. For a device in one network, say like the trusted network, to talk to something in the untrusted network, the traffic would have to go through the firewall. And we can put rules on the firewall to stop that. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. Is by default, we don't really want these devices in different networks talking to one another. We want to keep them apart from each other, so that if something in, say, like this smart network area gets breached, we don't want it being able to get access to something in our trusted network. So that firewall doesn't just protect us from the internet, it protects all of these devices from each other effectively. I mean, sure, all of the devices in the trusted network can talk to each other, but our smart devices can't talk to them unless we've deliberately put some rule in here to allow that. So because we've got a switch that supports multiple VLANs and we're putting our devices into different VLANs, a lot then comes down to what the firewall is. I mean, it's either going to have a lot of ports, which we plug into different ports on the switch, and then we assign those individual ports to different VLANs, because this thing's going to be the default gateway for each VLAN. Or this firewall has got one interface going out to the internet and then one into the switch, in which case the firewall itself needs to support multiple VLANs. So whereas like a PC, for example, belongs to, say, VLAN 100, the firewall link is going to be able to be capable of carrying multiple VLANs. So that's just what sets them slightly apart. But it would mean, bear in mind, if you've only got one link, you're going to have a firewall that does support multiple VLANs, and most would do anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. I mean, you don't have to spend a fortune on that firewall to get that capability, but it's just something to bear in mind. Now, apart from the wired connections needing separate VLANs, so do the wireless connections that you've got. There are various devices dotted around that need wireless connectivity, so we need a dedicated access point to be able to pull that off. You might need several of them around your house. It depends on your Wi-Fi coverage, but that access point has to be able to support multiple SSIDs, and it has to support multiple VLANs. Because what you do is you tie the SSIDs to different VLANs. So for example, I've got one here called trusted. So that means if I connect the actual mobile phone here to the trusted network on the access point puts that traffic into VLAN 100, for example. And that means these devices here, my NAS and my PC, they're connected into a port on the PC, on the switch rather. The switch has those ports configured for VLAN 100. When the phone sends traffic into this trusted SSID network, the access point pops that traffic out into VLAN 100, so it allows the wired and wireless devices to talk to each other in that VLAN. But it keeps my phone and my tablet separate, because the tablet's talking to the untrusted network, and the access point's going to put that into, say, 200. Now, unfortunately, that's going to limit your options. It's pretty easy enough to get a firewall and a switch that supports multiple VLANs. Trying to get an access point to do that's a lot more harder. A lot of the retail vendors that supply Wi-Fi solutions don't support multiple VLANs for some strange reason. They're selling to, I would imagine they're selling to home users that probably wouldn't expect they would need them. That's usually something more targeted towards commercial buyers, but it does limit your options. I mean, mesh Wi-Fi's, for example, became a lot more popular But the trouble is, I never saw any particular vendor selling to retail that did that. So your choices are either commercial solutions or the vendors that kind of straddle the retail and commercial. So they're not that much more expensive, but you definitely need an access point that can support multiple VLANs. Otherwise, all of your Wi-Fi devices can talk to each other. And if you've got smart devices that are operating on Wi-Fi, then it's pointless. You're back to a flat network and you're not really helping yourself. So you do have to take that on board as an extra security requirement. But the good thing about it is once you've got that is you can keep everything separate. And you're getting that security whereby nothing can talk to another network. This device over here can't talk to, the tablet unless the traffic has been allowed through the firewall. So it's a containment sort of thing. We're trying to mitigate the problem if some device goes rogue because it's been hacked. So yeah, there's quite a bit to do in terms of separating all these networks out. But I've got 4 networks as an example. Each needs different requirements, but I'm trying to mitigate the damage, and it's a case of, I'll start off with what I've called a trusted network. Now, I wouldn't necessarily actually create any SSIDs, for example, called trusted, untrusted, IoT, and guest. I'm just using it like an example. I mean, if you put those on your access point, it's going to make it absolutely obvious to anybody going past your house exactly what's doing what. So, come up with other names, random letters, numbers, whatever, as long as you know what they are. It makes it less obvious to the hacker. I mean, that's what security involves. You're trying to make it as difficult as possible. But in this particular case, we've got what I'm calling a trusted network. So these are devices that, these are devices that don't just, they're not just some device that we trust because we bought them and built them and so on. It's a case of these devices, I need to give them elevated privileges. So for example, the PC, for instance, I need to be able to manage the Wi-Fi, the switches, the firewalls, and so on. I need to manage them from somewhere. So I've got a PC to do that. So it means your access points and probably the management box that goes with it, the switch, the firewall. They've all got an IP address in VLAN 100, for example. And I want to lock things down so that device and only that device has access to them. So I've got to really trust that device. I'm not going to go so far as having a management network, although, if you've got the money, by all means do it, because that means you need a physical device that does nothing but management, and it's going to that cost you more money. Whereas here, this is probably like a typical day-to-day device that you use, and just you maybe, that you can trust enough. It's up to date on software, it's up to date on patching. You should be careful enough not to click on some link in an email or go to some website that's been infected by malware and so on. You have to have enough trust in that device that it's highly unlikely it would get compromised, in which case you can trust it enough to go into this network to be able to manage your devices, but also to be able to get access to your smart hub, because you've got to be able to set up rules and so on, like over a web browser, for example, to that device. Now, by that, I'm not talking about a device that's managed out in the cloud, for example. I'm talking about one that's local. It doesn't need the internet to work. You manage it through your computer, through your phone or whatever. And that's the reason why I've got a phone in here as well, for instance. This phone doesn't just need access to the internet. It needs to manage this smart hub, for example. It's also the reason why the NAS goes in there, because this is our most trusted network. This is where all our data would be expected to be. The expectation is the PC, we want to transfer rates as quickly as possible, so we want them both in the same network. If it has to go through a firewall, it'll be slower. So we've got these all in our most trusted network effectively. So you only put devices in here that you are absolutely certain, or you're reasonably sure, I should say, that aren't going to get compromised. Nothing's perfect, nothing's guaranteed, but you should be taking enough security to keep your software up to date on your NAS, your PC, your phone, and so on, so that you don't expect these to get hacked. Then we get over to what's called the untrusted network. So these are still devices that you own. You would expect them to need internet access, but you probably expect them to need access to the NAS, for example, to stream videos, for example. So for that reason, they go into this untrusted network. I mean, TVs, for example, I wouldn't expect them to be that secure. It's not something I expect a manufacturer to take seriously, but I still, might need to give it access to the the NAS in this trusted network. There's no way I'm going to put that into the guest network. No matter how much I don't trust it, I can't risk it in the guest network. So I'll put it into this intermediary network, what we're calling untrusted. If it doesn't need access to the NAS, yeah, it goes into the guest network. So that's the only reason this exists. This network doesn't have access to anything else. It's mostly for the internet, but in case it needs access to the NAS. So these are devices, you own, you've bought, but yeah, whether you put them here or not just depends on their requirements. Now, this network is what I've called IoT, so Internet of Things. So this is where we put our smart home devices and appliances. These are devices that are on your own network and what you can control locally. So I'm not talking about devices that we control through the cloud. Personally, I would try to stay well clear of that. If you've got a device that you have to control through the cloud, don't put them here. Put them there. Put them in the guest network. This network is for devices that need to talk directly to each other. So maybe the hub, it's a case of that needs to talk directly to the light bulb to turn the lights on and off. Or, it's got to go through another hub to talk to their light bulbs there, for example. But they have direct access to each other. They need that. They don't go out to the cloud, they just talk directly to each other. So this is all contained within this little network. They don't need access to anything else on your network. Ideally, they don't need access to anything on the internet other than for firmware updates. I'd be very, very strict in terms of the sort of rules I allow on here. In the case of if this hub needs access to the internet for firmware updates, I'll find out what protocols it needs, I'll find out what ports it needs, and I'll lock it down so that that specific device has that type of access, because chances are this vendor does things different to this vendor, for example. So every device has its own set of rules. If there's some common, some commonality where they're all using HTTPS to pull firmware updates down, then fine, I'll give them all access to HTTPS on the internet. If you want to be really, really strict, you should, you could be able to literally have those rules disabled so you only update them when every now and again when you do the firmware updates. So that way, even if they do get compromised, they can't break out of this network at all. They can't even get out of the internet. Entirely up to you. It comes down to, a personal choice and so on. But the idea is these are all self-contained and they can't get out to the rest of your network, and they've got limited access to the internet. So, like I say, I wouldn't risk any device, a smart device that's got access or is controlled through a cloud service solution. If you have to go down that path, say like a smart fridge, for example, then we put it onto the guest account. Because the problem is like that phone, for example, if we want to send instructions to a smart appliance that's controlled out on the internet, the phone will go and talk to some device on the internet, and that internet device will then send instructions to the phone, or it will relay them, for example. It operates totally independently of your network, because this device is basically forming a tunnel that bypasses your firewalls and connects to something out there on the internet. If somebody manages to hack into that, or if, say, like the accounts have been compromised, somebody's leaked them, somebody else can log into that account and start controlling your appliance, for example. These firewalls go completely out the window because this device initiated a connection out to the internet and it's keeping that connection permanently open. So this device is exposed to the cloud provider 24/7. So we put it into what's called a guest account, or a guest network, I should say. All that these devices can do is access the internet, and they'll only get the access that they need. So if this doesn't need HTTPS access, it's not going to need it. If I can lock this down to specific ports, specific protocols, specific servers, I'll do that. I'm not going to have some broad rule for everything, because every device is going to be pretty much different, usually anyway. So I'm going to be very, very strict in terms of what I allow on the internet. And I've just got to accept the fact that that's going to pose a risk to the rest of the devices on this network. But because it's in a guest network, it's going to be very restricted in what it can do, because I would expect these devices to be operating on Wi-Fi. It's very unlikely you're going to have like a wired network connection next to every single appliance, in your house. So the vendors are going to make these Wi-Fi capable. And the good thing about Wi-Fi is typically they support a guest network where you just tick a box and says, this is a guest network. When that happens, what the actual access point does, it keeps these devices apart. So this device, for example, will be able to go out and talk to the firewall and then get out to the internet, but it wouldn't be able to talk to this device wirelessly. These two devices, they're on the guest network, or at least the wireless network. They can't talk to each other because the access point doesn't allow it. They'll try, but it won't allow it. So it's a case of, yeah, we keep them nicely separated. So worst case scenario should be that somebody hacks that cloud provider, gets access to your fridge, for example, tumble dryer, and starts messing around with things, but it doesn't affect other devices. It can't be used as a jumping point, especially to get access into your NAS, for example. I certainly can't think of a reason I'd want the fridge to have access to the NAS, but you know, it is what it is. When it comes to things like televisions, for example, there might be an exception to the rule, hence the reason why they go into an untrusted network, but again, only if necessary. If it doesn't need access to your NAS, put it in the guest account. Same goes with an employer laptop. That'll need certain access to the internet. It doesn't need access to anything on your network, so it's a guest of your network, so we keep it completely isolated away from everything else in your network. So for that reason, we do put it into the guest account. Again, find out what protocols it needs. It might be using HTTPS for a VPN solution. It might be using IPsec. Find out what requirements it needs and pin it down in your firewall to only allow it the access that it needs. But definitely keep it away from the rest of your network. And by doing that, it makes the whole thing a lot safer and a lot more secure. Even if something does get compromised, like in here, for example, it can't break out to here. Worst case scenario is, yeah, your PC does end up getting hacked, and that is bad, so you've really got to protect that. But chances are it's going to be something like one of these devices or one of these devices that gets hacked. That's why we're keeping everything apart. And by having these extra 2 layers, we're a lot more protected from the internet. One other thing I would say is that when it comes to like the switch, you might want like power over Ethernet as well, especially for like an access point, because that'll be able to power your access point without needing to run an extra electrical cable to the actual access point to keep it turned on, for example. By having power over Ethernet, it supplies the power through the RJ45 cable. You could, for instance, buy these from the same vendor and then you can manage them all through the same portal. But don't do it through the cloud. Do it through some managed device. Whether it's a little mini PC that you've got that's running on running a hypervisor with a virtual machine, or whether you buy a dedicated management box to control all this lot. By all means, go down that solution. As long as you keep these two separate, they're different vendors. It's not too much of a problem here. Just don't manage it through the cloud. You might be looking at that stock image that I've got there, knowing full well that it's a case of, they got hacked in 2021, didn't they? Yeah. And it's a case of, their cloud service was hacked, which meant that if you were managing, their devices in the cloud, you were potentially compromised. Your network was now compromised. So there was a big rush for everybody to reset their passwords, their 2-factor authentication, everything. Whereas if you were managing it internally, you didn't have that problem. So these are things you do have to consider. There's a bit of extra things. You don't have to spend a ton of money to be able to do this sort of stuff. As I say, for most of these devices, you can either buy a retail version of them. By all means, go out to the full commercial version. For something like the access point, you're talking about somebody who straddles the retail and the commercial markets. I mean, I still do trust that vendor to a certain extent as long as I'm managing it internally. But what you really want to do is to try as much as you can to stay away from cloud managed solutions. Leave that for the businesses. For them, they'll be moving their services out of data centers and putting them into the cloud because it saves them a lot of money. It's a lot more agile. For a home user, you're not going to put that much money into the security inspection of traffic and so on. You can do that. There's all sorts of services you can purchase. You can beef up the firewall to inspect stuff. But for most of us, it's a case of we don't have that luxury. So we want to stay well clear of cloud solutions unless it's like the vendors aren't giving you any other option. If you want a smart tumble dryer and your only option is a cloud managed one, then okay. But just make sure you're aware of the risk and you're going to put it into this guest network. Most of the time, the worst case scenario is someone will hack your washing machine or what have you. but at least they can't get access to the rest of this stuff as long as you're keeping everything up to date and you're being very strict with your rules. But otherwise, it's pretty safe. I mean, I wouldn't trust a vendor who's doing a cloud version of this, especially. I mean, I know there's some folks who are trying to reassure people it's not a risk, in the sense that most people were complaining of the fact that if you lose your internet connection, these things stop working. Vendors are trying to mitigate that by making your device survive an internet loss for several days. The bigger concern that I've got, and what I'm trying to emphasize, is if this device is managed on the cloud, it's at risk of being compromised, and it can be compromised directly from the internet. So just try to steer clear of cloud. And as long as you go down this sort of solution, as long as you maintain it properly, your network should be a lot more secure, and the internet will be a lot more secure if we all follow this similar security approach. Well, thanks for making it to the end of this video. I really do hope you found it useful. If so, then do click the like button and share, because that encourages YouTube's algorithm to suggest it to other people who might find it useful as well. If you're new to the channel and you'd like to see more content like this, then yeah, do subscribe. Just remember to click the little bell icon though, that way you'll get notifications when I send new content out. If you've got any comments, any suggestions, if you want to leave any feedback at all, please post that in the comments section below. And if you'd like to support the channel, I've left links to both Patreon and PayPal in the description below. But above all, thanks very much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.